Dead hand. You're a Soviet general sitting in a bunker and the screens just went white. Phone lines to Moscow. Dead. The Kremlin. Silent. Every person who's supposed to give the order to fire back is probably ash. But the system isn't. Deep inside a hardened command post, a network of sensors is already reading the signs. Seismic shocks, light flashes, radiation spikes, pressure drops. The sensors compare those readings against a set of thresholds and reach one conclusion. A nuclear strike just happened. Then it checks one more thing. Can it reach anyone in the senior military chain? If the answer's no, it moves to the next step. A special rocket launches from a protected silo. It doesn't carry a warhead, it carries a radio signal. As it climbs into the upper atmosphere, it broadcasts a single coded instruction to every nuclear silo, every submarine, and every bomber in the Soviet arsenal. The message is simple: launch everything. They called it the perimeter system. The West gave it a better name: Dead Hand. It came online in the early 80s, built for one very specific nightmare. What if the Americans wiped out every Soviet leader in 15 minutes? Who gives the order to fire back? Nobody. That was the problem. So they handed the decision to a machine. If your enemy knows that killing your leadership still triggers a full counterstrike, they'll never try a first strike. That's the theory. It's terrifying. And honestly, it makes a kind of cold, horrible sense. Western intelligence found out slowly. A key defector spilled details in the 90s. Analysts confirmed parts of it through satellite images and signals intelligence. Russian officials have since admitted the system exists and hinted it's been upgraded. Here's what keeps people up at night. If the sensors glitch, if they misread a lightning storm or a satellite malfunction as a nuclear strike, the system doesn't pause. It doesn't reconsider. It launches, one malfunction away from the end of the world, and it's still running. Project Iceworm. You're standing on a frozen plain in northwestern Greenland. The wind cuts through everything. And beneath your feet, there's a city. 200 soldiers living and working in heated tunnels under the ice, powered by a portable nuclear reactor. There's a hospital, a chapel, a barbershop, a movie theater. The whole place is called Camp Century. And it was real. You can find the footage. But Camp Century was a cover story. The real project was called Iceworm, and the plan was insane. Dig a tunnel network spanning 52,000 square miles under the Greenland ice sheet, roughly 3 times the size of Denmark. Then fill it with rail lines and up to 600 mobile nuclear missiles on rolling launchers. The missiles would move constantly. Soviet satellites could photograph the surface all day long, but they'd never know where the weapons were at any given moment. You can't destroy what you can't find. Engineers designed the tunnels to sit about 28 feet below the surface. Construction at Camp Century proved it could work. Soldiers carved corridors, installed plumbing, and lived in the ice for months. But the ice had other plans. Geologists figured out that the glacier was moving way faster than anyone predicted. Tunnels were buckling, walls closing in. The corridors soldiers had carefully carved were slowly crushing themselves. The engineering problem just wasn't solvable with 60s technology. And there was a bigger issue. Denmark owned Greenland. The United States never told the Danish government it was planning to hide nuclear weapons under their territory. When the project was declassified in '96, it caused a diplomatic mess that echoed for years. Then there was the environmental disaster. When Camp Century was abandoned in '67, the Army left everything behind. 52,000 gallons of diesel fuel, radioactive coolant, PCBS. All of it was buried under the ice and forgotten. Climate scientists now warn that as the ice sheet melts, those toxins could reach the surface and drain into the ocean. A project that was built to stay hidden forever, slowly being exposed by the very planet it was designed to protect. And remember this one, because the same government that hid missiles under Greenland ice had another idea for what to put in the sky. Project West Ford. Look up at the night sky and picture something you can't see. A belt of metal circling the Earth. Not satellites, not a space station. Needles. 480 million of them. In the early 60s, the US military had a communications problem. Long-distance signals bounced off the natural ionosphere, but that layer was unpredictable. Undersea cables worked, but Soviet subs could cut them in hours. If both systems died at the wrong moment, the military would lose contact with forces overseas right when it mattered most. An MIT engineer named Walter Morrow came up with a fix that sounds like science fiction. Launch millions of tiny copper wires into orbit and let them spread into a thin ring around the planet. Each wire was less than 2 centimeters long, thinner than a human hair. At that size, they'd act as tiny radio mirrors and bounce microwave signals back to Earth. Basically, an artificial ionosphere made of metal. The first launch in '61 failed. The needles clumped together instead of spreading out. The second try in '63 worked. The ring formed, signals bounced off it, and the technology was proven. But the backlash was immediate and global. Astronomers were furious. A permanent belt of metal debris would mess with radio telescopes and optical observations. The Royal Astronomical Society protested. Soviet scientists called it vandalism of space. The international scientific community united against it in a rare display of actually agreeing on something. The military quietly killed the project. Communication satellites like Telstar made the needle belt unnecessary. But here's the thing. The needles never came down. Clumps of copper are still orbiting the Earth more than 60 years later. One of the earliest examples of us deliberately junking up space. And the question it raised hasn't been answered. Who gets to alter the orbital environment for military purposes? What happens when a temporary experiment leaves a permanent scar? Starfish Prime, July 9th. 1962. A year before JFK was shot. A year before the Beatles broke through. The Cold War was at a fever pitch, and someone decided to detonate a nuclear bomb in space. Not in space exactly. High above the Pacific, at about 400 kilometers altitude. The yield was 1.4 megatons. And the explosion didn't leave a crater. It left something worse. A storm of high-energy electrons slammed into the magnetosphere and created an artificial radiation belt. In the hours that followed, satellites started dying. Solar cells that worked fine an hour earlier suddenly lost power. Command systems stopped answering. Commercial and scientific satellites went dark one by one. On the ground, 1,400 kilometers away in Hawaii, streetlights blew out. Communications equipment shorted. Burglar alarms went off across Oahu for no reason. One bomb, 400 kilometers up, and it reached across an ocean to kill the lights. Every sensor on every monitoring satellite went blind at the same time. Scientists scrambled to read what little telemetry survived. The artificial radiation belt stuck around for months, slowly frying anything in its path. Here's what changed. Starfish Prime proved that a single high-altitude nuke could cripple an entire nation's space infrastructure and knock out communications across a continent. One bomb. That's all it takes. Both sides noticed. The U.S. set up a classified program called Program 437 to explore the idea further. The Soviets ran their own tests, Project K. Everyone saw the same thing. Space wasn't just the next frontier, it was the next target. The backlash was fast. The Partial Test Ban Treaty came the next year. It banned nuclear explosions in the atmosphere and space. Later, the Outer Space Treaty built more legal fences. Those rules exist because of what one test proved, and what terrified everyone who saw the data. Satellites got hardened. Engineers added shielding. But the lesson hasn't faded. Modern life runs on space hardware, GPS, banking, weather, military comms, and all of it can be damaged from 400 kilometers up. That vulnerability hasn't been fixed. It's just been ignored. Strategic Defense Initiative. You hear the pitch and picture a shield of light around the planet. Reagan announced it in '83, and the goal sounded like something from a movie. build a defense system that could find and destroy incoming nuclear missiles before they hit the ground. And the press called it Star Wars. The labs called it the future. The budget called it a bottomless pit. First came Excalibur. Scientists imagined an X-ray laser, pumped by an actual nuclear explosion, that would fire a burst of beams at dozens of missiles at once. The physics was brutal. Underground tests produced data, but also a ton of controversy about how much usable energy you could actually get, and whether the device would survive its own power source long enough to work. Then, the neutral particle beam. In '89, a flight experiment called Bear put a beam weapon on a rocket. The idea was to fire a stream of particles at a warhead in space and fry its electronics. The flight proved the components worked in orbit. It also proved how heavy, power-hungry, and complicated the system was. Not exactly battlefield-ready. And then came the wildest idea, brilliant pebbles. Instead of one giant weapon, you'd scatter hundreds or thousands of small, smart interceptors into low orbit. They'd hunt incoming missiles on their own and crash into them. No human needed. It sounded great on paper. Autonomous, distributed, hard to knock out. It also raised obvious questions about putting thousands of self-guided weapons in orbit, and hoping none of them made a mistake. The independent reviews were brutal. The American Physical Society said the most exotic proposals needed breakthroughs far beyond current physics. The GAO said the cost models were basically guesswork. Congress started asking hard questions about a program that needed decades and eye-watering funding to maybe work. But here's what doesn't get talked about enough. The program failed at its main goal. Sure, but the labs learned a massive amount. X-ray detector techniques went straight into medical imaging. Laser research led to later tactical weapons. Sensor tech helped build better planetary probes. SDI didn't build a missile shield. It built the toolkit for 21st century technology. And the bigger question, can you shield a country from nuclear missiles, is still unanswered. We just stopped trying so loudly. Operation Popeye. You're a pilot climbing through a low, heavy sky, and your commander tells you to drop a line of flares into a thunderhead. These flares don't explode the usual way. They burn a fine chemical that seeds ice crystals inside the cloud, making it rain sooner and harder. The mission sounds simple. Make roads muddy. Make trails impassable. Slow the enemy down. The target was supply routes during the Vietnam War, and the weapon was weather. Here's how it works. Silver iodide acts as a nucleus for ice formation in freezing cloud moisture. Engineers packed the compound into chemical flares and dropped them from aircraft into storm clouds. The science was well known. Researchers had been testing cloud seeding since the 40s. What made Popeye different was scale and secrecy. The program went from test ranges to active military operations across foreign territory under tight code names. That secrecy mattered because when rain falls, nobody can easily prove why. Officials later briefed Congress behind closed doors and admitted to a sustained campaign, hundreds of sorties, thousands of seeding flares. Internal reports used military language like mission effect and talked about how well it degraded enemy roads. Those records are powerful. They show intent and practice. But do they prove it actually worked? That's the fight. The National Research Council looked at the data and said this: cloud seeding can sometimes increase rainfall under the right conditions. Local results are plausible. But at a regional or seasonal scale, you can't separate seeded rain from natural monsoon variation without proper controls. And there were none. Officials could show they flew the missions. They couldn't show a clean causal chain from chemical flare to strategic advantage. The monsoon was already brutal. Popeye might have made it worse, or it might have barely mattered. Nobody could tell. But the political fallout didn't wait for the science. Once people found out that a government had been weaponizing weather, the outrage was immediate. Negotiators wrote the NMOD Treaty, a ban on hostile environmental modification with widespread, long-lasting, or severe effects. The fact that such a treaty was even necessary tells you something. Using weather over someone else's land risks harm to civilians, farms, and entire ecosystems. And the secrecy meant zero public debate, zero oversight. That combination, plausible capability plus hidden use, is the real danger, not just with weather, with everything on this list. Ekranoplan. You're a CIA analyst staring at a satellite photograph of the Caspian Sea, and something in the image doesn't make sense. The object on the water is enormous, wings like a plane, hull like a ship. It's longer than a football field. You measure it twice. 92 meters long, nearly 38-meter wingspan, 10 jet engines clustered at the nose. Nothing in any Western database looks even close. Your colleagues slap a nickname on it that sticks for decades. The Caspian Sea Monster. The Soviets called it the KM, Korabl Maquette, roughly ship prototype. Designed by Rostislav Alexeyev at the Central Hydrofoil Design Bureau, it first flew in '66. It was the largest aircraft on the planet, and almost nobody outside the Soviet Union had a clue it existed. The trick was something called ground effect. When a wing flies very close to a surface, within a few meters, an air cushion builds up underneath that massively boosts lift and cuts drag. The KM rode this cushion 5 to 10 meters above the water at over 500 kilometers per hour. Let that sink in. And too fast for any ship, too low for most radar, essentially invisible. The military applications were obvious. A vehicle that could haul hundreds of tons of cargo or troops at jet speed across open ocean, completely undetectable. The Soviets saw it as their answer to American aircraft carriers. You can't shoot what you can't see, and you can't outrun something doing 300 miles an hour at wave height. And they went further. The Lune-class Ekranoplan entered service in '87, armed with 6 Mosquet cruise missiles, each capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, a ship killer that could race across the sea at rooftop height, fire its payload, and vanish before a fleet knew what happened. But reality got in the way. The things struggled in rough seas. Takeoff ate massive amounts of fuel. Flying that fast, that low, demanded constant pilot concentration with zero margin for error. And building them was brutally expensive. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the program went with it. The surviving machines were abandoned on shorelines. The Lun sits beached on the Caspian coast right now, a rusting monument to an idea that ran out of money before it ran out of potential. The technology worked. That's not the question. The question is what happens if someone builds them again, with modern materials, modern guidance systems, and modern missiles. The blueprints still exist. The physics hasn't changed. CIA heart attack, gun. 1975, a Senate hearing room. Senator Frank Church holds up a pistol for the cameras. Modified, oversized barrel, small telescopic sight. He calls it by its official name, the non-discernible microbionoculator. Yeah? Try saying that 3 times fast. The CIA apparently thought calling it a heart attack gun was too honest. The weapon was built under a program called MK Naomi. A young agency recruit named Mary Embry helped identify the perfect poison, saxitoxin, a naturally occurring killer found in certain shellfish. The stuff is extraordinarily lethal. A speck can shut down the nervous system and stop the heart cold. The delivery method was straight out of a thriller. Scientists at Fort Detrick mixed the toxin with water, froze it into a tiny dart, basically a sliver of ice, and loaded it into the modified pistol. Effective range, 100 meters. On impact, it'd leave a mark no wider than a mosquito bite. The ice melts, the toxin hits the bloodstream, and the target dies of what any coroner would call a natural heart attack. No bullet, no casing, no traceable poison in a standard autopsy, designed from the ground up to kill and leave zero evidence. The Church Committee put all of this on live television. And the gun wasn't even the worst part. The hearings exposed a pattern. Covert assassination research, biological weapons stockpiling, illegal surveillance on American citizens. The CIA had stashed 11 grams of shellfish toxin in a vault even after Nixon personally ordered every biological weapon destroyed in '69. Church held up the gun. He asked the questions nobody had been allowed to ask. How many of these exist? Who authorized them? Were they ever used on a real target? The agency gave the kind of answers agencies give. The weapon was confirmed. The stockpile was confirmed. A full accounting of how many were built, or whether any were fired at a human being. That never came. Those hearings changed the rules. Executive orders banned assassination as a tool of foreign policy. The Senate and House Intelligence Committees were created to oversee covert operations. All because a senator held up a gun and the public saw it. But here's the part that lingers. Not as history, but as a question. If one agency built this weapon in the '60s, with the materials of that era, what's possible now? With modern biotech, modern materials, modern delivery systems? The gun was retired. The idea behind it wasn't. Novichok. You're holding a small vial. 2 chemicals inside, each one harmless on its own. Mix them together, and you've got one of the deadliest nerve agents ever created. The story broke when a Soviet scientist named Vil Mirzayanov went public in the early '90s. He'd worked inside a program called Foliant, and what he described was chilling. The Soviets had developed an entirely new family of nerve agents, and they'd designed them to be almost impossible to detect. The trick was binary design. 2 weak or harmless chemicals, precursors, that only become lethal when combined at the moment of use. Each precursor on its own looks like an ordinary industrial chemical. They pass through security, border checks, even basic lab screening. Nobody flags them. Chemically, these agents are distant cousins of older nerve poisons. They block the enzyme that tells your nerves to stop firing, your muscles lock up, your lungs stop working. The twist with the Novichok family was modified nitrogen chemistry that changed how long the agent lasted and how hard it was to clean up. Some variants resist the standard treatments that work on older nerve agents. Then, in 2018, they showed up in the real world, Salisbury, England. A former Russian intelligence officer and his daughter were found slumped on a park bench. Labs in multiple countries tested blood and environmental samples. They didn't find intact agent. It breaks down fast. But they found the fingerprints. Specific chemical markers that only show up when your body has encountered this exact family of poisons. The same markers appeared after a poisoning in Germany 2 years later. The OPCW, the International Chemical Weapons Watchdog, confirmed the results. Multiple independent labs. Same conclusion. And just like that, it went from whistleblower allegation to international crisis. Diplomatic expulsions, sanctions, treaty amendments. But here's what's still missing. A full declassified list of which variants were stockpiled, in what quantities, and where. The precursors are still out there. They still look like ordinary chemicals. And the medical countermeasures we have? They weren't built for agents this advanced. The chemistry moved faster than the defenses. That gap hasn't been closed. Invention Secrecy Act. Here's one that doesn't involve a weapon or a warhead, but in some ways, it might be the most dangerous invention on this list, because it's a machine for hiding other inventions. You file a patent. Maybe it's a breakthrough in energy storage. Maybe it's a new kind of medical device. The patent office reviews it, and instead of publishing your invention to the world, which is what patents are designed to do, you get a letter. Short. Vague. The government has decided your invention threatens national security. Your patent won't be published. You can't file abroad. You can't show it to investors. And the order can be renewed, year after year after year. This isn't hypothetical. It's the Invention Secrecy Act of 1951, and it's been active for over 70 years. Look, there's a version of this that makes sense. If someone patents a nuclear trigger design, maybe the world doesn't need to see the blueprints. Fair enough. But the problem is scale, and the problem is oversight. Thousands of patents have been slapped with secrecy orders. The public only sees the total count through FOIA requests, not what was hidden or why. Reporters have found inventors who waited decades for the gag order to lift. Small companies that went under because they couldn't show their own product to a customer. Universities with promising medical research sitting in a drawer while people who could have been helped were told to wait. Academic studies back this up. When a secrecy order lands on a patent, follow-on inventions drop sharply. Other researchers can't build on what they can't see. Citations vanish. The ripple effect slows down entire fields. And the categories aren't limited to weapons. Energy technology, communications, materials, science, medical devices, all eligible, all potentially buried. The fixes aren't complicated. Publish the aggregate data more often. Require a stronger public interest test before orders get renewed. Create a real appeals process with compensation for inventors whose businesses were destroyed. And expand whistleblower protections for cases where secrecy orders are clearly being misused. But the deepest question isn't about policy. It's about what we'll never know. Somewhere in a filing cabinet, there might be a patent for something that could have changed medicine, or energy, or communication, locked away for decades because someone checked a box. And we'd never even know it was missing. 10 inventions. Built by the most powerful governments on Earth. Hidden from the people those governments were supposed to protect. Some of these technologies stayed secret for decades. Some are still classified. And the scariest part isn't what they built. It's that the same playbook, invent in secret, test in secret, bury in secret, is almost certainly still running. The only difference is we haven't found out about those ones yet.